Friends, good morning. Love is holy, and young love is beautiful. And because beautiful things are also holy things, I believe that stories between young people are given throughout the Bible to remind us that this is a holy thing. So David and Jonathan are probably the two most famous queer icons in the entire Bible, and it's because their story is so beautiful. It's heartbreaking and captivating, and it is entirely relatable to anyone who has ever experienced the intensity of love in their formative years. The history of David himself, it's peppered throughout the Hebrew Bible. David appears by name in 7 different books in the Old Testament, and David is probably also the first actual figure that appears by name in the archaeological record. David's likely the first figure who we have actual evidence for, that he existed as a figure in history rather than a figure of mythology. And David's fascinating, and he's very complicated, and he's apparently breathtakingly attractive. This was taken as a given by nearly every sculptor and painter throughout Western history. These artists were given to reading their Bibles and, for the most part, recreating visually the stories that they encountered in these pages. So last week I described the way in which societies throughout history can be homophobic, or they can be supportive and affirming, however that they are for the most part indifferent toward love and affection between same-gender couples. And I'm deeply indebted to the scholarship, again, of this work by Ted Jennings, Jr. His work dealing with the Hebrew Bible is entitled Jacob's Wound. In it, he lays out the research behind these matters. The books of Samuel, the 2 books of Samuel, are stories about warriors and kings. And they tell us a lot about the cultures in which they were written. We return now again to this idea of intentional family, but male companionship, specifically male partnerships that transcended biological kingship. We heard the relationship between David and Ruth and Naomi. David identifying himself as the son of Jesse, who of course is the child of Obed, who is the son of Ruth and Naomi. That's that connection that spans this story. These stories are, most of them, almost all of them, are stories about the relationship between 2 men. And it's not just loving stories. The stories of the warriors in the Hebrew Bible, they usually begin with 2 guys and the relationship between them, whether they loved each other and made plans together or they hated each other and tried to murder each other. We can imagine ourselves sitting in a room gathered around the flickering light of an oil lamp in some great theater in the Levant, and listening to the storyteller preparing to share this ancient tale of heroic destinies. And in every case, the story has got this cast of characters, and at the top of the banner is 2 guys and their story. A lot of the time, it's 2 kings. Much of the time, it is the story of a young man and Yahweh, who is the warrior god. Sometimes it's 2 brothers, and more often than not, it's a man with political power and a man with holy authority. This is the dynamic of a king versus a prophet. But here at the end of the first book of Samuel and the beginning of the second, we have the introduction of something new. The introduction of an extremely complicated literary device that it's now so common that it's cliche. It's so common today that people, they fail to notice it. But we have, for the very first time in the narrative arc of the Bible, a shift away from this story of just 2 men, and in the words of Ted Jennings, quote, the first great love triangle in Western literature. We have a cast of 3 characters. In the section of the story we just heard today, we have King Saul, who is the villain, And David is this brash young warrior who rises from poverty to find himself in the palace courts. And Jonathan, the kind and lovely prince who's fallen madly in love. And Prince Jonathan is more or less always Prince Jonathan through the story. It breaks my heart a little bit that Jonathan doesn't really get his own character arc in the Hebrew Bible. But Saul and David are very complicated figures. At this point in the story of David, in his life, he is young and strong and beautiful, but he's also a bit hapless. One of my colleagues describes David as a classic messy bisexual. And these three characters, Saul and David and Jonathan, are beautifully written because they're relatable. Saul and David are both described in the Bible as jaw-droppingly beautiful men. In the story we just heard, Saul is now older, and he has become jealous and bitter and violent. But he wasn't always this way. If I had the financial resources to create my own 4-part limited HBO series, I would open with Saul in his youth. If there's any Hollywood producers out there, just hint, just get a hold of it. This is good. Open with Saul as a young man. The Bible describes Saul as tall and handsome. In 1 Samuel 9, the book reads, quote, "Now there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Saul, and he was a choice and handsome man. And there was not a more handsome man among all the peoples. From his shoulders and up he was taller than any of the people." End quote. And Saul is first chosen by Yahweh. Later, David is chosen for similar reasons. He's beautiful. I don't know why God only seems to choose the most physically attractive men to be his shield bearers in the story. I didn't write this book. The heroic men are the most beautiful. So it's no surprise that later when Saul asks this powerful young warrior to be brought into the palace courts, that Saul's own son Jonathan sees him, and before they ever speak a single word, it says, in that very moment, Jonathan's soul was knit to David's. And in the words of Ted Jennings again, in the court of King Saul, it was, quote, love at first sight. There's this line from the first meeting of David and Jonathan. Quote, "Jonathan stripped himself of the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt." End quote. And that's kind of a lot. I remember learning about this little moment in one of my Old Testament studies courses. God, I think it was Ken Stone teaching this. And Jonathan gives David his robe and his armor and his sword and his bow and his belt. And Dr. Stone, he said, you kind of have to imagine yourself as Saul, as the dad in the story. And you've got your son Jonathan, right? Now maybe your son's he's come home from college, right? And you say, "Oh, how's it going, son?" And he says, "It's great, Dad. I made a new friend. His name's Dave." You know? And you think, "Oh, good. It's good. The boy's made a friend." Your son says, "Yeah, we get along really great. I gave him my favorite basketball jersey." You know, and you think, "Wow, well, that's nice of him. We must be good friends." You know. And then he says, "And I gave him my Xbox. You know, and I gave him my hunting rifle, and I gave him my pickup truck." You know. You might think, I think there's something going on here, you know. Prince Jonathan is infatuated with David. This is clearly obvious to King Saul. And Saul becomes consumed with jealousy. Maybe jealousy for David's appearance, but certainly jealousy for his strength, his courage, and his celebrity. When Saul discovers that his own son and the heir to his throne is in love with David, it boils over into murderous rage. So at that banquet feast that they described, the king and the prince are sitting at the table, and Saul looks at David's chair and it's empty. And he asks, Jonathan, where's your little friend? Where's David? And Jonathan shares this so convincing lie. He says, David's had to return to Bethlehem. It was a family thing. Okay? And Saul's anger explodes. The words of Saul, the words of this father to his son, these words, these insults, they may sound ancient or archaic to our ears, but the intent behind these words is blisteringly obvious to any queer man whose own father has discovered his forbidden love, or who has turned against his son. And this line from 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 30, they've translated this 1,000 different ways into English, and I'm not going to share some of the more colorful translations of this because it's easy to understand Saul's intent. These words cut me. A father is raging at his son at the banquet table in front of all of these guests, attacking and assaulting him. And the Bible says, quote, "Suddenly Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said, 'You son of a rebellious woman, I know you have chosen this man David, the son of Jesse. You have chosen him to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's own nakedness. For as long as David lives upon the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established.'" Well, and so why is it that Jonathan's love for David will prevent Prince Jonathan's kingdom from being established? And so the homophobic rage of a father to his gay son. Yeah. So it happens that the king decides to kill this beautiful David. And Jonathan helps David escape. Together, they hide in this distant field where they can be alone. David and Jonathan alone, together. And in that field, in that wilderness place where they're alone together, we see the same beautiful moment of covenant, the same moment of words of love in the midst of terror that were shared by Ruth and Naomi, David's own great grandmothers. Quote, "When they were alone, Jonathan made a promise to David. 'While I am still alive, show me the faithful love of the Lord, but if I die, never cut off your love from my house.' Then Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own life." End quote. This is the holy beauty of young love. And it is the holy beauty of forbidden love. An experience that is shared by so many young queer couples. Be it in the barrenness of that field or in the darkness of a closet. Be it words spoken from lips pressed against another's ear amidst the noise of a dance floor. Faces near to one another in the sacred space of a gay bar. Beneath the shelter of a quiet cabin at a summer camp, or the privacy of a car parked on a lonely road, or in the whispered spaces of the hallways of high school between classes, the private anonymity of words shared in a text message, or the grace of a shy and private smile between two young men sitting in the pews of the church sanctuary. This private, shared moment of honesty and beauty is set in contrast against the horrible bigotry that can come from within one's own family. David and Jonathan are in love, And Jonathan risks his life to protect David from his father's wrath. And this is terrifying because it is real and it is dangerous. And holy and beautiful things are often dangerous because queer love is often dangerous. This story was told to us, handed down from generation to generation, because the light of queer love has been flickering from generation to generation. To the storytellers and the scribes, the people who preserved this story, the thousands of generations who passed the stories from heart to heart and page to page, they protected this love for us. They preserved this love in here. They immortalized this love because the ancestors knew that someday a queer person, a young couple perhaps, would see this love in here, and they would read the story, and then they would see themselves in the Bible. They would see that they too were written into the pages of this book. And Jonathan is clever, and the plan works. David's life is saved, but at the cost of their relationship. David flees into the wilderness, and the story ends in heartbreak, with Prince Jonathan returning alone to the city. Now, much else happens following this story. Saul then pursues David, and David spares Saul's life in a turnabout. All of this affair with Jonathan becomes just one chapter in the early days of this great epic story of David. But later in another book, at the beginning of 2 Samuel, a messenger arrives at David's camp bearing terrible news. Saul is dead, fallen in battle, and with him has fallen his son, Jonathan. The king is dead, and the prince has fallen as well. And David, in one of the most poignant moments in this entire story, reaches for his music. He composes and he sings the Song of the Bow, a holy and sacred song. It is a lament. Your glory, O Israel, lies slain upon your high places. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. And so David, through his tears, he remembers and confesses again his love for this prince to whom he was bound by covenant. Now that line, how the mighty have fallen, this is echoed through the halls of history. How the mighty have fallen. It's now become a cliche. But listen, from now on, when you hear this turn of phrase, how the mighty have fallen, I want you to remember David singing for his lost Jonathan. Because David's lament, his song, was so powerful that it continues to echo through history. This is the holiness of young queer love. This is a holy story woven into the pages of this book. And so then it will echo forever. But for us, it is as the poet reminds us, young and old alike, because perhaps it reminds us old lovers when we're tempted to look with cynicism at the passion of young love. Let not young souls be smothered out before they do quaint deeds and fully flaunt their pride. It is the world's one crime its babes grow dull. Its young are ox-like, limp, leaden-eyed. Not that they starve, but starve so dreamlessly. Not that they sow, but that they seldom reap. Not that they serve, but have no gods to serve. Not that they die, but that they die like sheep. Let us remember Jonathan forever. Amen.